Something is changing the people in my apartment building. I don't know how better to describe the present phenomena rather than to explain, as simply as I can, that they come back different. When they speak, their eyes never move. They never leave for a second, piercing, dwelling shadow orbs that seem to know some deep secret that I could never understand. They seem to be all connected somehow, in some inexplicable way, as if they are all in on some cruel joke that I couldn't follow. Unless I went to the elevator, of course. I mention this now, not because I'm certain at the time of writing, but because I have suspicions that have taken place over the past few weeks, things that have grown in me which must be described here. I am writing this because I am scared. I can hear it speaking to me even now. That chime calling from down the long hallway. I need someone to know what happened to me if I come back different. You see, having my sights on this apparition and trying my best to discover the source of this irregularity, I have come to believe that it is the elevator that changes them, the type with a drawing scissor pattern cast in iron that groans and shrieks when it pulls to a gradual close with every lift. There is something about it that I don't like, something that I haven't liked since I first moved into this place with my girlfriend, Sarah, nearly 2 months ago. It is something difficult to explain as anything more than a pervasive feeling, an inner sense of menace regarding this particular elevator. It seems to have an unnatural aura about it, a delightful, almost cheeriness when that metal gate expands, welcoming you in. Inviting. I think now would be a good time to let you know that I have never stepped foot into that contraption. Not once, not even when the incredibly pleasant manager, a spectacled cherry blonde woman in her early 30s, gave me a tour of the old structure and invited me in. I'm dreadfully scared of heights, and even more so of tight spaces. One look at those twisting metal frames, those drawn-in walls, that sometimes flickering red sun of a light above was all it took for me to refuse politely and always take the 7 flights of stairs up to our apartment. Let me tell you about the building. It is old, yellow brick, constructed in the 1910s, originally built as a hotel with a snaring sort of ivy that gnawed its way up much of its face. It is beautiful, full of charisma and character in a way that nothing built in more modern times can ever be. The lights in the lobby and hallways are always on, an endearing rose glow, casting the interior in a jaunty shine, one without any shadows at all. It was built by hand over many years, an artisanal creation, a work of art. I guess that is what enticed us here, the pulling inward sensation of light and the ground swelling of warmness that emanated from the place. It felt like home the minute that we arrived. Home. Home in a way in which we had never felt it. A toasty hearth, piping hot chocolate, and a good book, and somehow, at different times, the feeling of company, being pleasantly out together at a welcoming bar, a place where everyone knew you and always would, where the taps kept on flowing, and sometimes, because everyone liked you, the drinks were on the house. There was something else too. More than the unbearably kind manager, her swirling red hair and unusually invasive eyes. It was the quality and terms of the contract. We had been searching for a place in the city for months, combing over 100 different residences, and never found one with an opportunity like this. A month-to-month lease, several $100s less than anything else of similar life and quality in the surrounding vicinity. It seemed too good to be true, and after reviewing the contract sheet twice over and finding not a hint of dishonesty from the manager, we decided we would be foolish to pass on an opportunity like this. If we didn't like it, of course, we could always leave. That was our understanding at the time. The first month was largely uneventful. We were getting accustomed to the neighbourhood, our new jobs in the city, cooking in a small half kitchen without a microwave. We noticed, even then, that the neighbours were a bit strange. The smiles were too wide and ate up much of their faces. Their eyes didn't seem to blink often enough, and they stood still, mostly when we greeted them in the hallway and on the stairs. More than once, I had the bizarre notion that they stayed that way, even after we left, standing still, unmoving, even when we were gone. I wrote this off as nothing, because of course it was. Things like this didn't exist, And if they did, wouldn't they exist off in some sequestered part of the country, some rural province where the ghost of a widow was said to inhabit an old farmhouse? We were in the city. We had hundreds of neighbours, and none of them said anything about any of it. They all seemed fine. It didn't bother us at first. Not enough anyway. Not for the first few weeks. We aren't particularly social and didn't spend much time with any of them. Who cared if they were a little off? That changed when we met our new neighbour in apartment 703. Henry, a sarcastic, sharply intelligent young man fresh out of university. He was working in an IT firm a few streets down from the building and moved in to avoid traffic. We connected immediately in a way that only like-minded people could and began to visit him in his apartment, most frequently to play board games, at which he was an absolute savant. He provided sincere companionship, a quality we had been lacking since our move. We laughed frequently and in jest, sometimes, would discuss how everyone else in the building seemed to have the same mannerisms. On one particular evening, Henry even pulled off one of his socks and stuffing it on his hand in one motion, made it talk in a voice that mimicked the manager. "Try it. Stay if you like." We laughed so hard it hurt, and remarked at the same time that she had said the exact same thing to us. He said then, with a smile, that if he believed in ghosts, they must have inhabited a building such as this. For some reason, this caused all of us to go silent for a while. Ghosts. Impossible. But still. I remember the night that Henry changed. I didn't get home until well after 9. Sarah had already prepared our famous garlic bread and tossed Greek salad, which we were bringing over to Henry's apartment for dinner. We planned to play Monopoly after. As always, Henry would generously start the game with significantly less wealth to give us a better chance of overtaking him. Sarah scolded me playfully, kissed me at the door, and said that we would be late, even though we both knew that Henry wouldn't care. He probably preferred it. I combed my hair and we went next door. No one answered on the first knock, or the second. We were getting worried by the third. His door was locked. It had never been locked before, not even when he went to work, which we had constantly tried to warn him could lead to trouble in the city. He said he didn't have much of anything of value, and if anyone wanted it, they could have it. Just as I was about to call his name, and then potentially call the police, we heard something beyond the door. A low shuffling of feet, slow, dragging across the scarred wooden floor. The door opened, and Henry was there, smiling so wide it looked like it hurt. When he spoke, his voice was too loud, and the words came out disjointed. "Hello, friends. Why don't you come in?" Sarah and I exchanged a glance and followed him inside. When I asked him how he was doing, he avoided the question entirely. When we put our food on the table, he didn't even look down at it. He stared, still, into our eyes, moving from Sarah back to me every few seconds, as if his very motion was set to some sort of invisible timer. He didn't eat, and we didn't eat either. We couldn't stand those eyes. We couldn't stand that jolly, huge grin, never faltering, even when his muscles began to twitch. Never. We left as soon as we could. I mentioned that I suddenly wasn't feeling well, that I was overheated and might be coming down with something of a fever. Henry didn't take the news poorly. He kept smiling, smiling, smiling. As we left, I looked back just once, seeing the door still open, seeing Henry there with that savage smirk plastered on his face, its new permanent home. I wondered if somehow he wasn't quite Henry anymore. I wondered if he was someone else entirely. And worse even, I wondered as we entered our apartment and closed and bolted the door if he was still standing there, just outside, with those wide eyes and bright teeth splayed out like perfect piano keys. I wondered all night, though I was much too scared to check the keyhole. We didn't see Henry for some time after that. We stopped seeing him go to work, and after another week or so, realised that we didn't really see anyone else enter or leave the building either. The thought began to come more frequently then, that they were here, always here, standing straight, right behind their closed doors, grinning madly, waiting for interaction. I pushed it from my mind and tried to focus on my work. If we didn't like it, we could always leave. And maybe we would, at the end of the month. Then, Sarah took the elevator. She was running late for work and had far too much to carry that day for her presentation. I offered to help her down, but she refused. I waved to her out the door, feeling strangely frightened and completely unsure why. It was 8 in the morning and there was no reason to be afraid. Nothing logical anyway. Nothing but anxious thoughts that filled my head with nightmares. I saw her step into the elevator, saw that metal maw stretch wide, protracting like jaws, and snap shut when she was inside. I thought, as I watched it envelop her in that bright red light and begin to take it downward, that something was horribly wrong. I wanted to call out to her, and I actually did run forward a few steps, but she smiled and waved and blew me a kiss. She didn't come home that night. I called her work and was assured that she never came in that day. Her boss was furious, but that was the least of my concerns. I called the police and told them that she was missing. They came and met me in the building. I called her family, we looked for her, but couldn't find anything. They questioned me. I didn't have any answers. I told them about that morning, how she had smiled and waved and climbed into the elevator on her way to work. That was all I knew. We were perfectly happy. I would never hurt her. She was missing for 3 days before she came back. I stopped going to work and was lying in bed, alone in the dark. I was distraught. I didn't know what to do. I had been looking for her for days. I heard keys move just outside the door, and my heart jumped. The doorknob turned, and I heard her feet shuffle in. I ran to her and wrapped her in my arms. Her muscles didn't move. She was standing straight, perfectly. "Hello, love," she said. "I'm home." That voice. I had heard it before. I grabbed her face in my hands and pulled her close. I could barely see her in the dark, but I knew what I would find there. Nothing. Distant, cold, unbreaking blankness. That was 2 days ago. She doesn't come to bed. She's standing by the door. I don't know what to do. I haven't been outside in days. I'm the only one left. I can't leave. I know that now. It won't let me. I know she lied. I can never leave. I'm going to take the elevator. I don't have a choice. It's calling me now. My head is ringing. It's telling me what to do. I don't know where it's going to take me. I can hear the chime down the hallway. I can hear that metal gate pull open, inviting me in. I'm alone. I don't want to be alone anymore. I don't know how long the pool has been there. It seems to have always existed, to always have been laying in wait, waiting for something, or maybe for someone. It doesn't matter how long it's been since the rain, it never seems to disappear or even to get shallower. It's such a little thing, no more than about 10 feet around, with patchy tufts of tall grass piercing the surface. It must only come up to your ankles, but something about its stillness, its almost lackluster, its persistence. In my youth, I never truly believed the thing to be cursed. I was told it was, and I was afraid for a time, but it passed as easily as a dream, like many childhood fears do. Now, as an adult, as someone battered and wearied by the world, you would think the place held even less meaning. I flatter myself that it does, usually. I do not believe in the Horsefly King. Not in the light of day, but sometimes when the sun sets over the park and the sanguine glow of it hits the still water in just the right way, or when the moon is cold and high over it, the place still captures a terror I have not known since childhood. The memorial park stands on the remains of a World War I battlefield. The barbed wire has been torn up, the craters from shelling filled in, grass planted in the mud, and all that remains of the butchery is a plaque in a picturesque little gazebo commemorating the battle. Sometimes children still find them, buried in the earth. I was a child myself when I first visited the place, when I first heard the story of the Horsefly King. It was a pale, sickly boy named Nicholas who first drew my attention to it, wearing a cheeky grin that only little boys and psychopaths can wear. I once saw him rip a caterpillar open with a nail to see what colour its insides were. He was that kind of boy, the kind you're afraid of as a child without fully understanding why. You see that puddle over there? I simply shrugged my shoulders. It's a puddle. His grin grew wider. That's where the horseflies lay their eggs. My skin crawled a bit, and I must have made a face. Like most people, I think, I have an aversion to the repulsive, biting creatures. The idea of their eggs and larvae crawling around in the filthy water was disgusting enough, but Nicholas didn't finish. Did you know only the females drink blood? He didn't wait for a reply. It's true, they need blood to lay their eggs. I heard they take all the blood they suck up, and they take it to this puddle and drop it in, right here. That's why it never goes away. It's a special puddle. At the age of 10, many years ago, such things didn't sound quite as ridiculous as they do now. I didn't necessarily believe him, but I had a morbid fascination all the same. Special? How? Well, he dropped his voice low, like he might be overheard. That's where he lives. Who? Their king. The horseflies, I mean. My mind immediately went to the more reasonable assumption that he was talking about some kind of colony, which was disgusting enough. A massive swollen horsefly at the bottom of the pool with a distended stomach and atrophied wings, drinking up blood. What, like a queen bee? That's disgusting. No, something else. Something worse. The puddle remained still and black in the light. One of the wretched things was buzzing in lazy circles above it, and the air shimmered. The heat, I suppose. I felt, or think I felt, something. Some change in the water's demeanour. I know how it sounds, but before it was sluggish, sleepy. Now it seemed to have perked up somehow. To my mind, it seemed that some great, invisible head had turned to face us and listen. The feeling passed, and even at that age, I was abashed for feeling that a puddle in the grass was looking at us. What are you talking about? It's what, 6 inches deep? Yeah, it's 6 inches deep, but 5 years ago, a girl named Emma wandered away from her parents and started screaming and screaming and screaming. She cried out for help, and her parents were just over that hill there. It took them no more than 20 seconds to get here, but by the time they did, she had drowned in it. Only 6 inches deep, and she drowned in it. I looked at Nicholas warily, trying to pass out if he was messing with me. Did they get the guy? He seemed exasperated, like I was an idiot for not immediately following his insane kid story. It wasn't a guy, that's what I'm telling you. Nobody was around. She wasn't hurt at all. There's nowhere for anyone to hide. They would have seen him. Nobody else was here. It was... He gestured with his eyes towards the puddle again. Him. The Horsefly King? You don't believe me? I had laughed at him a bit, more to make myself feel better than anything else. You can't be afraid of something you laugh off as ridiculous after all. He had grown angry with me. Alright, if it's so stupid, put your hand in it. What? You heard me. The childish grin returned. There's no such thing as a Horsefly King, right? So put your hand in the water. Watch what happens. Just watch. Gross. I'm not sticking my hand in some dirty puddle horseflies lay eggs in. Because you're scared he'll get you? I'm not. This continued in the way children's arguments do, before I settled on a compromise. I would take a stick lying nearby and put it in, stir the water a bit, smack the surface, and if no monster ate me, he had to admit he was full of crap. And I did. I hesitated a moment, staring at the murky water, and in that moment, it didn't look like a puddle. It looked like a diseased hole in the world, a window to a different place, an infinite world of blood and dirt and biting things. A moment in which I was almost convinced something was going to jump out and eat me. But it didn't. I put the stick in until I felt the earth below. It was only a depression of a few inches after all. I laughed and stirred and splashed the water. I called in a sing-song voice for the Horsefly King to come out and play, to come and bite Nicholas. He had pouted the whole walk home, like he had actually wanted something to drag me under. But it had been nothing after all. A scary story about a pool of water in the park, told by a maladjusted boy trying to get a rise out of his mate. I didn't think about it for years afterwards. Sometimes I would return to the park and see the pool, just as stagnant, just as deep as it always was, shining in the sun with the colours of water so contaminated it looked like oil. I'd smile a bit to myself and remember Nicholas and his killing caterpillars and his story of Horsefly Kings, and wonder where he was. I hadn't spoken to him in years, when I heard of his passing. It was hardly a surprise. Everyone knew he'd been a troubled boy, grown into a neurotic young man. There were no gasps of shock when he took his life, only wary sighs and shaking heads. Tongues clicking and saying, "I suppose we should have seen it coming and it was only a matter of time." But there were whispers. Gossip, really. That's all it was. I was raised to not speak ill of the dead, and I never found out for sure, so I hesitate to slander his memory or bring undue grief to those closer to him than I. But the way he had done it, people said, it wasn't natural. Nobody seemed exactly sure how he'd done it, only that it was horrible. I heard conflicting accounts. I heard he had choked himself to death trying to cram flypaper down his throat. I heard he had taken a pin and stabbed himself through to the bone in hundreds of places all over his body, like how they used to test for witches in the old days, the man who told me that had said. I heard one that gave me pause more than any other. I heard that he was found in his bed, staring at the ceiling, bone dry, but his face was frozen in a scream of horror, and that his lungs were full of filthy water. Filthy water and eggs. A voice in my head wanted to correct the woman who told me that version. Not my own voice, surely. Where did that thought come from? I still lay awake nights and wonder. I was in my 20s then, too old for fairy tales. I did not believe in the Horsefly King. I do not believe in the Horsefly King, but the nightmares started soon after. My mind was full of anxiety, full of depression and that half-formed mix of guilt and grief when you lose someone you used to be close to, or didn't know as well as you should. That's why I see the pool in my dreams, why I've been seeing it for almost a decade. It was scary. A boy who scared me as a child killed himself. Nightmares are perfectly normal. Everyone has nightmares. In mine, I'm standing in front of the pool, and there are flies buzzing around it, much larger than any real flies. Their wings are grey and ragged and papery, and you can see the veins, almost like bats. Torn, buzzing, biting bats, with chitinous black skin and red eyes and a dagger for a mouth. I look closer and see their eyes are drops of blood, and they're not buzzing. They're screaming. They're screaming and flying in ritual circles around the pool that's begun to ripple and change shape. Something is inside it, and it's coming to the surface, and if I see what it is, I'll go insane and die of fright. And I awake in bed, screaming and soaked with the sweat of terror, the kind that penetrates through your skin down to the bone and makes you feel so cold you forget how warmth feels. I don't sleep much anymore, so I lay awake and wonder whose voice was telling me it wasn't just filthy water, it was eggs too. I do not believe in the Horsefly King. But I've gained something of a morbid interest recently. I wondered where the story came from, you see. Perfectly natural. I thought maybe it was a depression left over from a shelling crater. The thought had a certain romance to it. A spot cursed by a man, or more probably a boy, his bones and tendons and flesh blasted apart and filled with shrapnel and mud, all for a senseless war. That would make a wonderful story. But it had already been there. I know, because I hunted tirelessly for any first-hand accounts of the battle that park desperately tries to make pretty, like makeup covering a black eye from... Forgive me. It's anxious work writing this all down. I don't want to give the impression I come apart at the seams over such fantastical and childish things. Yes, the battle. A journal from one Lieutenant Ronan spoke of the damn thing. It seems impossible it should have survived a century and all the landscaping, but somehow it did. A persistent blemish, if nothing else. It seems our boys had dug their trenches just a few yards behind the thing, and that, even then, it was a source of vague repulsion and horror. Ronan never uses the term Horsefly King. I still don't know where Nicholas came up with that. If perhaps a voice, not quite his own, just said it in his head one day. The same voice that assured me yes, eggs in his lungs, and once he's in the ground. I get distracted easily. It's hard to gather my thoughts. At any rate, the pool is mentioned as the probable cause for one Private McBride getting trench foot. Ronan said he had walked through the water going to scout no man's land, and that he thought something bit him. He was a healthy boy, 19 years old, but that night, when they stripped his boot off, they cut through the sock that was stuck to his skin, like flypaper. His foot had already begun to rot. There were maggots in it, Ronan said, and he had started screaming. They had to take his foot off. He didn't survive the procedure. A few nights later, one of the sentries was found in the barbed wire. He had caught himself in it somehow in the night and ripped himself open in maybe a dozen places, struggling to free himself. Ronan stops to describe the smell of his organs hanging out of his stomach, his intestines drooping in the dirt. The sentry's blood ran in a rivulet straight into the pool. It was strange, he remarked in his next entry, that no one should hear him screaming. He must have been in that wire for upwards of an hour before he died, but nobody heard him. To a man, not one of the soldiers had heard him scream. It seems, after that incident, the men avoided the thing like the plague for their few remaining days on Earth. The battle was a catastrophic failure. The boys butchered and shelled and gassed. Sometimes I wondered what became of the Germans who killed them. There's a cold certainty in my heart that they didn't fare much better. I do not believe in the Horsefly King. I've just done some digging, that's all. A friend of mine died. Not a friend. A terrifying boy died a terrifying death, and I've grown anxious, and that is all. But after the war, when the park was first planted, one of the men who had landscaped it was found laying next to the pool. Every inch of him was covered with horseflies, a black, crawling mass covering his skin. They'd bitten him to death. They'd bitten him on his tongue and his eyeballs and crawled into his throat. In 1954, a woman who frequented the park suddenly went raving mad. She nearly killed herself trying to destroy her ears, trying to, quote, make the buzzing stop. She died in the hospital, her hands clamped over her ears. In 1978, a man murdered his own wife, his own pregnant wife. I will spare you the details, but you should know the police found him next to the pool, having slit his own throat after dropping something small and bloody into it like a sacrifice. In 1993, the girl named Emma disappeared. Nicholas hadn't known the whole story. She didn't drown in the pool. Not immediately. She vanished without a trace. They searched for her for 3 months before they found her body face down in the pool, right where she had vanished. And then there was Nicholas. I know what these things are. Isolated incidents, a meaningless correlation, my own confirmation bias. Every minute of every day, someone walks right past the dirty puddle and nothing happens to them at all. But sometimes, just sometimes, when the sun hits it just right. My nightmares have grown worse of late. Nicholas's voice is hard to hear. He gurgles and water keeps pouring out of his mouth as he stands over me in bed. I think I see something wriggling in his voice box. He tells me the Horsefly King bit him good, just like I asked. Bit him so he burned and drowned but didn't die. He can never really die. He says the eggs need blood, and the blood needs pain, and all the stagnant water in the world is his domain. The pools are his eyes, and he sees everything I do. And to me, it's been decades, but to him, I'm an amusing little distraction for a moment. Nicholas smiles, and I can see his teeth are black as he says, like a boy pulling the wings of a fly that bit him. That's what you are to him. You bit him, and he will do things to your body you didn't think were possible. He will make you scream and scream and scream. I do not believe in the Horsefly King. It's tinnitus ringing in my ears that just sounds a bit like a buzz sometimes, and the red circle in the sky is the setting sun and it reflects off the water. It is not the eye of a great fly or a drop of blood drawn from God's flesh with the unholy dagger mouth of an abomination that tortures men and women for decades because it feels a moment of boredom. I fear some horrible fate will befall me. I think I may be sick. Whose dark dreams are these? Whose deranged thoughts? Not my own. They can't be my own. It is as if a fever has come over me, slow cooking my brain and my skull. I say it is only sometimes. I try to force myself to assure you it's just my writing about it that has made me come undone, that I am a sane man, that nothing is in that water. There are no ghosts or goblins or beasties in this world. I tell myself that all the time. But when Nicholas floats over me at night, and the still water dripping from my ceiling onto my face, he tells me the Horsefly King likes the taste of lies the best. I purchased a revolver. I don't know what I intend to do with it. I dare not tell anyone. They look at me strangely enough since I fell into the bottle. They fear I may do harm to myself. I fear something else might. That's why I'm going tonight. I'm polishing off this bottle of bourbon and leaving this letter for friends and loved ones to grimace and sob over and doctors to dissect and fools to laugh at. I'm taking my gun and going down to that water. I'm going to walk in and wait a little while and see what happens. I'm sure I have nothing to fear after all. I do not believe in the Horsefly King. Mount Harmon is where I have lived my whole life, where I tell this tale from my childhood. It's one of these small towns in New England where everybody knows each other, the kind of place that looks like it hasn't changed in 50 years. The biggest attraction is the gas station, where most people buy their groceries as well as gossip about the residents. You get the idea. There's not much going on here. Anyway, it was really weird when a new neighbour showed up. Not a person, mind you. An entire house. It just showed up out of nowhere. Mrs. Danforth was the first one to notice, naturally, as it was suddenly right next door to her. She called Sheriff Franklin, and once people saw the sheriff heading over towards a road, everybody knew something was going on up there. Vinny, my older brother, was the one who told me about it. "Ricky, Franklin just rolled up to the Danforth Road. You want to come check it out?" I did. It beat whatever mind-numbing thing I'd been doing. We grabbed our bikes and made our way up the hill. My brother and I figured one of the Danforths had died. They were quite old. "Hey, where did that come from?" I nearly crashed into Vinny as he braked abruptly, seeing the house that had never been there before. We both sat with our mouths hanging open. The sheriff's cruiser was parked on the other side of the road. The Danforths stood, talking with him on their porch, all three peering at the new house in fear. It was large, 3 stories, with a long curved driveway that led to a barn beside it. Despite being a new structure, the house itself looked like it had been sitting there for about 200 years. The paint was deteriorating, the porch sagged, and the upstairs windows looked like they were cracked. We watched the sheriff go timidly up to the end of the driveway, ducking low and trying to look through the windows. By now, more people had joined us, at what seemed like a safe distance from it. Other kids from the middle school gathered around us where we had parked. A few speculated on what the house could be. "It's a ghost house, no doubt," Donnie Maron said, his confidence selling his theory to a few onlookers who nodded in agreement. "Nah, it can't be a ghost house. It's solid. Plain to see as you and I," Tim Desmond pitched his opinion in. "Yeah? Well then, how did it get here?" Donnie asked, folding his arms and wrinkling his nose at Tim. They glared at each other. "Maybe it was invisible," Tim Farley retaliated, folding his arms as well. "That's stupid. Then somebody would have crashed into it." Their debate got rather heated. It seemed that no one really knew what to do about it. Franklin and Deputy Revis brought down caution tape and roadblocks. It wasn't reassuring to see the way they kept a close watch on the house the whole time, neither daring to put the tape on the structure. They closed down the entire road instead, keeping everyone from getting near it. Not that anyone dared to. A town meeting was scheduled to decide how to proceed. For the first time in my life, I wished I was allowed to attend, opting to listen crouched down by the window instead. We weren't the only kids who made their way to hear the outcome. Donnie and Tim were there, along with about half our middle school. The meeting was long, involved a lot of shouting, caused tension between families, and in the process gave all us middle schoolers reason to pick on each other for where our families aligned themselves. It was a thrilling thing to be spying on, in other words. They ended up forming two sides. One that thought the house should be demolished, while the other half said it should be left alone. There were various reasons for either side. I was curious how our parents would vote, not hearing their voices arguing along with the rest. As people started to make their way through the doors, we all fled, trying to act like we'd been playing pick-up ball. Grim-faced parents called on us to go home. "So, how are you going to vote, Pop?" Vinny couldn't wait any longer when we crossed the front threshold, badgering my father before he had slipped his shoes off. He looked at Vinny and I and simply pointed upstairs. This was his way of letting us know he would be talking to our mother in private. We ran up the steps, both shoving each other for the best spot on the top of the stairs to hear down into the living room. As usual, Vinny won and cupped his ear. I found myself holding my breath, eager to hear what my father had to say. It would probably be safer to leave it. My mother decided to start the conversation after a long spell of silence. How do we know it isn't dangerous keeping it up? The discussion was less exciting than we had hoped, but it ended with my father saying he thought it should be demolished, and if it came to it, he would help take it down. My mother said she wished he wouldn't. We had a quiet dinner that evening. Our parents sent us to bed earlier than usual after. I tapped on Vinny's door when I heard snoring coming from the master bedroom. He let me in, shutting the door quickly. I could already tell he was eager to discuss something. "We should go look at it, right now," he whispered excitedly. I wasn't entirely surprised to hear him say this, but my stomach was already filling with butterflies at the prospect. "Vin, what if we get caught?" I was trying to reason. The argument was shaky though. We were seasoned veterans at leaving our house at night. Vinny scoffed, putting his sweatshirt over his head. He started tying his laces. It seemed I had little chance of persuading him not to go. "Don't tell me you're going to wuss out." He looked at my nervous posture. I bit my lip. I knew it was a bad idea. But I didn't want him to go by himself though. "No, I'll get ready," I said, regretting it immediately. I went back to my room and got dressed, then met Vinny by the back door. We grabbed our bikes out of the yard and peeled up the hill. Vinny was eager to get there, going extra fast. I, on the other hand, felt like each pedal was putting me closer to certain death. Once we got to the roadblock, Vinny parked his bike next to it and left me behind, making his way up to the driveway. I glanced up at the house. In the dark, it looked all the more menacing, hostile even. I shuddered, hoping that we wouldn't be staying long. Vinny had his toes at the bottom of the driveway, staring up at the house with a longing look. This is as close as anybody has gotten. he said softly. He was right. Not even our sheriff had been where he was. I couldn't bring myself to stand next to him. Something primal told me not to. He stared at the house for a long time, inching his toes a bit further into the driveway every now and then. Once his heels were completely across, I got nervous. Vinny, let's go. It's late. This isn't a good idea. We have school tomorrow. He finally turned away from the house, addressing me with disdain. Fine, but we're going to come back. This is important stuff, man. It's like we're exploring the moon. The next day, the school was abuzz. The only topic was the house. Even the teachers got into our debates. The votes were to be tallied the next day to see what to do with the house itself. After last bell, I made my way over to the bike rack to meet Vinny, unsurprised to find him bragging about our midnight excursion to Donnie and a few other 8th graders. Is he full of it or what? Donnie asked when he saw me coming up. I shook my head. No, we really went to see it, I replied. Donnie spit on the ground and addressed Vinny. I call BS. There's no way you went to the drive. Let's see you do it again. Vinny rose to the challenge, eager to prove to Donnie he wasn't afraid. Okay, Donnie, meet me tonight. I'll show you. Be there at midnight, he told him. That night, I waited for Vinny to signal to me that it was time. When he came to get me, I tried to convince him to bail. He wasn't having it. No way, and have Donnie tell everyone I was too afraid to meet him? Plus, what if they bulldoze it down? Don't you want to be able to say that you were brave enough to go up to it? It didn't really matter to me. I was only feeling dread at the prospect of returning. Again, I found myself being dragged along, not wanting Vinny to be there alone in case Donnie didn't show. As we got to the roadblock, I could see Donnie's silhouette and somebody else parked beside him. As we got closer, I realised it was Tim. I told him we were going. He wanted to come too. Donnie gestured to Tim. I was kind of glad to have more people around this time. I hadn't liked the way Vinny was looking at the house last time. He made me think I might have to drag him away from it. The more the merrier, eh? Alright, Donnie, watch and learn. Donnie strode toward the driveway nonchalantly as we watched from the road. I held my breath as Vinny went even further than he had the night before. He went up the drive about 12 paces, then turned around, facing us with a huge grin on his face. Tim clapped sarcastically. Vinny took a bow and ran back over to us. Alright, so I guess you're not so full of crap, Donnie relented. But I can do better than that. He marched up to the driveway, taking a nervous glance at the house before he ran up just ahead of where Vinny had stopped. Tim clapped again. Donnie flipped us off before he came back over. My stomach was churning, feeling that we were really pushing our luck. Vinny was mad that Donnie had outdone him, saying he would do better than that. I begged him not to, making myself look like a wimp, but I was finally able to pry him away. Hey Vinny, maybe leave the baby at home next time, Donnie said, climbing on his bike and taking off down the hill with Tim. Vinny gave me a lot of crap the whole way home, saying that I cost him a victory. I didn't care. The new rivalry made me feel nauseous. I knew nothing good could come of it. The next day, we had the outcome of the vote at noon, which ended in dramatic fashion. Mrs. Danforth had begged the town to leave the structure up, saying she thought demolishing it would only release whatever was held within onto the world. She shocked everybody by saying that they were moving out, going a county over and leaving the house for the last 50 years and the town they had lived in their whole lives. About 20 people pitched in to help them load up. Then they were gone, Mrs. Danforth weeping as they rode away. The only thing this meant to Vinny was that he could now venture to the mysterious house whenever he felt like it, without anybody around to see him. He and Donnie upped the ante when they all met up to play the game again. They had a wooden chip that was painted blue on one side and red on the other. After they argued over who got to pick the colour first, Donnie ended up with red and Vinny with blue. They would place the chip at their feet, leaving their colour right side up, until the other person came to pick it up and walk it further. The first day we used the chip, Vinny made it halfway to the barn. Donnie claimed he had something to do when it was his turn, opting to call it quits at that point. Every time he went, he would go a little further, able to beat Donnie by a few feet. Tim and I were there, only to be witnesses it seemed. Some words circulated about the game they were playing, but even though Vinny was prone to bragging, he realised if he confirmed it, somebody would put a stop to it. Donnie was just as tight-lipped, surprisingly. The game continued. Vinny, now only a few steps away from the barn. Every piece of me told me to stop him, to prevent him from going any further, but some morbid curiosity would overcome me, wondering if my brother may just prove to us the house was ordinary after all. As he smugly placed the chip down and strode back to us, Donnie was scowling. He looked like he was ready to prove something. "Alright, Vin, get your notebook out for this one," he taunted. He jogged to where the chip was resting, but unlike they had done up to that point, he tossed it up towards the front porch. It landed with the blue side up, just below the steps. Tim and I exchanged looks. Vinny's expression didn't change. Donnie chuckled as he walked back, bumping into Vinny on purpose. "I changed the rules. Whoever side it lands on has to walk to that spot now," he said. Vinny looked like he was going to war as he made his way toward the chip. I put myself in front of him. "Vinny, please, don't," I begged. He shoved me aside. His eyes were focused on the porch, barely registering me. "You know I have to," was all he said, continuing on his way. It was nerve-wracking to watch him go. Each step he got closer, we grew more tense. Even Donnie began to second-guess himself. "Hey, Vinny, let's just get another thing to mark with. I think this might be a bad call," he shouted, to no avail. Vinny had let this thrill become an obsession. There was no stopping him. Finally, he was bending down to pick up the chip. He held it high for us to see before he placed it on the top step, blue side up. We left after that, silently processing the last round. Vinny had purposefully called on himself to go up the steps. It seemed he no longer had anything to prove to Donnie or anybody else. He was caught up in the rush he got from it. He came to me that night with an idea. "I'm going in next time," he said. It didn't surprise me, but I found tears running down my cheeks. I knew nothing I said would make a difference. I nodded my head. "I'm going to tie a rope to my waist. If anything goes wrong, you guys can just pull me back out," he continued. I fell asleep crying that night, not knowing how to stop what I feared would happen tomorrow. Tim and Donnie were waiting for us the next day, gravely silent, waiting for Vinny to address them. He tied the rope and explained what he wanted them to do, asking me to be at the front line. "Vinny, I love you," I whispered, trying not to cry. To my surprise, Donnie and Tim were also misty-eyed, clapping Vinny on the back and wishing him good luck. Vinny looked at us fondly, giving me a hug before turning away. I watched the rope uncoil by my feet until there was nearly nothing left. Vinny was on the top step. He looked back at us, then reached for the door. I wanted to scream at him to stop, to turn back and take me home, beg him to read me stories out of his favourite books, to ruffle my hair, to flash me his wicked smile. But I couldn't. Some part of me had to know, just like he did, what this house was. I tightened my grip on the rope as he pushed the battered door open, revealing the dark entryway. He was there for a few seconds. Then he disappeared from view. The rope nearly escaped from me. Something had yanked all three of us forward into the driveway. I kept my feet dug into the dirt, but it was no use. Whatever had a hold of Vinny was taking us all with him. My hands were being ripped apart. Tim and Donnie were screaming behind me, all of us still keeping the rope in our grasp despite the agony. I was wailing, barely able to breathe from the exertion and terror. We were heading at the front steps with alarming speed. My heels left the ground and I tried bracing myself against the steps, pushing back with everything I had. By then, Tim had let go, screaming at Donnie and I to do the same. I flew upwards, smashing my knees and shins into the splintered wooden steps, being dragged to the doorway. I let out a cry of despair, fear, rage. I let go just before I was pulled through the dark entryway, falling to the porch and rolling to my feet, desperate to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside. I would never get one. The loop that had been tied around Vinny's waist was tossed out at me, the door slamming shut immediately after. In my shock, I lay down, unable to comprehend what had happened. Donnie ran up the steps and pulled me to my feet, taking me down the steps and away from whatever was in that house. The rest is a blur. I made it home. Tim and Donnie had to retell what had happened up there. I was too shocked to speak. I moved into the old Danford house when I got older. I didn't buy it. It wasn't for sale. But nobody was going to stop me from living there. I spent my nights on the porch, looking into the upstairs window. My brother staring back, surrounded by darkness. Not a day older than the last time I saw him. It started with my 10th grade English teacher, Mr. Baldwin, showing up late for class. Before his arrival, several of my classmates had made the usual joke about being legally allowed to go home if Mr. Baldwin didn't show up after 15 minutes. That's right, kids have been making that joke as far back as the 80s. But after 15 minutes, and Mr. Baldwin still hadn't shown up, a sense of unease started to creep its way into the classroom. No one left or got out of the desks. We simply sat there and watched the clock tick away. "I guess teachers play hooky too," my best friend Owen said to me. Owen Fielder was a sardonic and sometimes aloof boy, with dark hair and fair appearance that I was envious of. "What do you suppose English teachers do when they play hooky, Pete? Do you think Mr. Baldwin is curled up with a dictionary somewhere?" "It's not just him," I said, suppressing a laugh and hugging a thumb behind me. There was an empty desk there. Larson never came today either. Hal Larson was a quiet boy. He was genuinely good-humoured, but always so quiet. I had run into Hal outside of school over the weekend, and he had said something strange, but I tried not to think about that. No one had showed much concern about his absence. After all, students were absent all the time. Kids got sick or played hooky. But teachers, well, teachers were always there, weren't they? And when they weren't, there was always a substitute teacher there in their place, ready to prove themselves. "Maybe they're both dead," a boy sitting behind me said. His name was Caleb Summers. Not that I would mind. One less boring teacher and one less numbnuts in the world. No, I wouldn't mind at all. Good riddance. Have a nice trip. See you next fall. "Shut up, rat boy," Owen said. Once in 8th grade, a rat had found its way into the school. When Caleb saw it, he screamed a high-pitched scream and nearly fainted. Since then, Owen had gotten to calling him Rat Boy. Normally, I wouldn't be one for calling names, but Caleb Rat Boy Summers was a shrewd and nasty kid and had a tendency to get on people's nerves. He was like a mosquito that kept buzzing at you and wouldn't stop, no matter how many times you swatted him away. The nickname was well suited for him. "Bite me, Fielder," Caleb said as he gave Owen the finger. "I'd rather bite into a cyanide capsule," Owen said, flipping the bird in return. "You shouldn't say things like that, Caleb," another boy said. He had a not-so-subtle southern drawl that I always found endearing. His name was Chester Higby. "What if they really are hurt?" "Ah, screw off, Hick," Caleb said. "I'm sure they're both fine, probably making out somewhere." The banter eventually died down, and a terrible silence had taken over the class. Then, approximately 35 minutes after class was supposed to have started, Mr. Baldwin stepped into the room. His face was pale and sweaty, and he looked nothing like the cool and hip teacher I was used to seeing at the start of every day. He looked tired, so very, very tired. "Hey guys," Mr. Baldwin said in a pallid voice. "Hey guys?" Normally, Mr. Baldwin would start the day with a hearty, "Morning, class," and whenever we didn't respond enthusiastically enough, he'd say in an even louder voice, "I said good morning, class." I don't know any other way of saying this, so I'll come out with it. Mr. Baldwin said, "Your classmate, Hal Larson, is dead. I was just in a meeting with the rest of the faculty. We're cancelling school for the day. You're welcome to use the phone in this room or in the main office to call your parents if you need to. We'll also have grief support later this week for those of you that need that. I'm so sorry, guys. I'm just so very sorry." A sort of dumb shock had taken over our class. Mr. Baldwin started sobbing, and it was weird seeing him cry. You never saw teachers cry. Occasionally you saw them at the supermarket, and that was strange enough. But you never saw them cry. No one said anything for what felt like an eternity, and then a girl started sobbing as well. Other students had similar reactions, and some asked Mr. Baldwin what happened, but he wouldn't say. Most of us just hung our heads in a kind of numb sorrow. This was the first time I'd experienced death this close. Sure, I had distant relatives that died, but I saw Hal Larson every day of the week, and now he was dead. It felt unreal. I thought of the encounter I had with Larson outside of school. I tried to forget it, but it was hard to forget now. The memory rang loud in my head. "Pete, you're not going to believe it," Larson had said, running up to me a couple days ago. His face was sweaty, and he was more energetic than usual, and he had a very intense look in his eyes. "I just saw my dead dog, man, and he was glowing. He was glowing. I missed him so much. I saw him. I swear it." Before I could even respond, he ran off. I shook away the memory and looked back at Caleb. When our eyes met, a defensive look came over his face. "What the hell are you looking at, Pete? It's not like... I didn't think he was actually..." But his voice trailed off, and he simply looked away in shame. Of course, rumours immediately started flying about how Hal Larson had died. The sort of low and nasty kind of gossip that only high schoolers can make. It wasn't until the evening news that we found out more details. Hal Larson's body had been found near a pond, completely lifeless. There had been no signs that he had drowned, and there were no signs of a struggle. The police said they were treating the case as a potential homicide, but weren't ruling out drugs or some kind of illness. It was all the information we were given. School resumed the next day, but it wasn't anything but a normal day. The school had brought over grief counsellors and experts who spoke to us at length about dealing with death and letting it all out. The police came as well, and asked if anyone knew anything. I told them about my encounter with Hal, what he said about his dog, but the officers just looked at me with raised eyebrows and then dismissed me like I was some annoying child. In between classes, as kids walked to and fro in the hallway, more rumours spread. "Aliens, man. It was the aliens that got him. He obviously OD'd. I got a cousin that OD'd. Hey, you got any more pills? What if there's really a killer out there? Oh Jesus, oh Jesus. I swear I saw him the other day. He said he saw his dead dog. Isn't that kind of strange? Said his dog was glowing. He was into some weird stuff, man. He was such a sweet guy. He was such an asshole. He was in with the wrong people. Oh Jesus, what if I'm next?" "It's wrong," Chester said in one of our afternoon classes. "All these terrible things that people are saying about Larson, it's just not right." "But he's savages," Owen said. "Guy hasn't been cold for more than 24 hours, and people are piling on him. Makes me want to hurl." "But what do you think happened?" I asked sincerely. I hated the gross rumours as well, but there was a part of me that deeply wanted to know why Larson had died. His death was a total mystery. It was almost as if the life had been sucked from his body. I told Owen and Chester about my encounter with Larson, and neither of them could make sense of it. "I don't know," Owen said sadly. "I don't want to know." "I hope it was peaceful," Chester said. "I hope whatever happened, he went peacefully." "No one dies peacefully," Caleb muttered under his breath. "Shut up, rat boy," Owen said, turning toward Caleb in disgust. "Nobody asked you, and stop saying creepy stuff like that." Caleb made a face at Owen, but said nothing else. It seemed to me that he was still dejected and ashamed of the comments he had made the other day, back when we all thought Larson was alive. To make matters worse for Caleb, more and more people were finding out about what he had said. Maybe they're both dead. Not that I would mind. No, I wouldn't mind at all. High school gossip was like a terrible game of telephone. Someone said one thing, and that one thing was stretched and pulled and changed until it no longer resembled the original thing it once was. Words were like wind, always flowing and changing direction. It was Summers, man. It was Summers that did Larson in. You hear what Summers said? He said, "Wish I'd killed Larson." No, he said he did kill Larson. Did you hear? Summers hated Larson. He had been planning this for years. Summers messed up in the head. He's a freak. Glowing. Said his dog was glowing. How did Summers do it? Oh Jesus, what if I'm next? Summers is going to get it. It didn't matter what Caleb actually said. His words had taken on a new life, and word eventually reached the adults about Caleb's little joke, or one of the telephone versions of it, and the police came to speak with him. Nothing came out of it, legally at least, but from that point on, whenever Caleb walked the hallways, people stepped away from him, like he smelled or had the plague. People would sneer and sometimes pushed him into a locker. Caleb Summers had become a leper. I almost feel sorry for Summers, Owen said one day after school. We were watching Caleb leave the school. Some kids were heckling him. Almost. Come on, Owen, I said. Caleb, he sucks, but he doesn't deserve this. Doesn't deserve it? Owen said, irritated. This is Caleb Summers we're talking about here. The same Caleb Summers that laughed at Molly Hansen when a cat went missing. The same Caleb Summers that called Darren Lowe you-know-what. The same Caleb Summers that cut Larry McDaniel's bicycle tyres. Far as I'm concerned, Rat Boy is getting what he deserves. I guess, I said. But he didn't have anything to do with Larson. This is high school, Pete, Owen said, matter-of-factly. So Rat Boy will get hazed a little bit. No one actually believes he's the killer. By next week, people have forgotten all about him. I could do nothing but shrug and hope that was the case. A vigil was held for Hal Larson on Friday night. It was a beautiful ceremony that took place on the high school's athletic field. Larson's parents spoke, and many of his teachers and classmates were scheduled to speak as well. Everyone lit candles, and the whole field was bright with little orange flames. I was with Owen and Chester near the back. I hope I never see my mom cry like that, Chester said. God, that was hard to take. I feel so bad for his parents. I don't know if my mom would be happy or sad if I died, Owen said. I couldn't tell if he was joking. It was hard to tell sometimes. I wonder if I would get a vigil like this if I died, I thought morbidly. Mr. Baldwin had taken the stage and was giving a speech, but his voice faded away into the background because of what I saw. I saw 3 people who were walking away from the vigil. Even in the dark, I could tell one of them was unmistakably Caleb. The 2 other figures were leading Caleb into the school. No, forcing him was more like it. I nudged Owen and Chester and pointed at the 3 figures moving in the dark. Oh, this is not good, Chester said in that southern drawl of his. We have to check it out, I said urgently. Do we have to? Owen said, but eventually sighed. All right, let's go. The 3 of us put out our candles, made our way to the school entrance and slipped inside the building. We walked down the school's darkened hallways. It was eerie being in school after dark. It didn't take long to find them. They were in the gymnasium. It was the screaming that gave them away. When we walked into the gym, Caleb was on the ground in tears, and his nose was bleeding. 2 students were standing over him. One of them was kicking Caleb, kicking him hard. The student who wasn't doing the kicking was Alex Hux. He was the quarterback of our football team. Alan, in a lot of ways, was unlike most jocks. He was an all-round decent guy who was nice to everybody. He hung out with the other jocks, but he'd also play cards with the nerds. He had a vast comic book collection, aced every test, and would sling a football 60 yards without even trying. He was a total Boy Scout, but tonight he towered over Caleb like some sort of vengeful Greek god. The other boy was Trevor Mattison. If Alan was Superman, Trevor was his Lex Luthor. He was fond of leather jackets and smoked regularly. He didn't care about school spirit or football games, and he flunked at almost everything. I don't think he had ever read a comic book in his life. He was the one who was kicking Caleb. Alex Hux and Trevor Mattison were both on two opposite ends of the high school spectrum, and seeing the two of them standing together was a surreal experience. Superman and Lex Luthor had joined forces. There had been so much heat on Caleb this week, so much frustration taken out on him, and now it had all come to this boiling point, where two students stood over him like a pair of lions ready to pounce on a gazelle. "What the hell is going on here?" I said. Alan and Trevor turned around. Caleb looked up, but there was no relief on his face. "What's it look like?" Trevor Mattison said, and there was a maddening gleam in his eyes. "We're giving Summers what he deserves." "I didn't do it," Caleb said, out of breath. "Shut up!" and Mattison gave him another kick. "Stop that!" I yelled. "Come on, Alan, this is insane. He didn't do anything." "What about you, Fielder?" Alan said darkly, and his face, which was normally so cheery, was a cold slab of stone. "You hate Summers as much as anybody. You don't think he deserves an ass-kicking?" "I think," Owen said. There was a slight hesitation in his voice. He looked at Caleb's pathetic form on the ground and gave another sigh. "I think Pete's right. Much as I don't like Rat Boy, he's no killer. We were all there when he said what he actually said. It was just a dumb joke. It was in poor taste, but that's all. He didn't even know Larson was dead at the time." "You boys are taking this way too far," Chester said softly. "You didn't hear what he said tonight," Alan said coldly. "Tell him what you said." "Go on, Summers, tell him," Trevor said. "Tell him what you told us, you freak." At first, it didn't seem like Caleb would say anything. He simply rubbed his bloody nose on his shoulder and spit on the gymnasium floor. Then he spoke. His voice was pallid and pitiful sounding. "I saw him. I saw Larson. I saw him tonight. He was glowing." No one said anything. We simply stared at him in dumb shock. In the back of my head, I thought of my encounter with Larson. I could tell Chester and Owen were thinking the same thing. Glowing. Larson had said his dead dog was glowing. And then Alan spoke. "He came running up to the vigil saying this nonsense. Larson's alive, Larson's alive. Can you imagine? It's bad enough what's been said about him this week. He couldn't just stay away tonight. Couldn't just leave it alone. He had to come and try roll everybody up with his BS. At Larson's vigil, for crying out loud. Imagine if Larson's parents had heard him. You should have stayed away, Summers. No one wants to see your face." So Hux and I got the idea of bringing him in here and giving him some justice, Trevor said, and again there was that maddening gleam in his eyes again. "We got him away before anybody could hear him. I gotta admit, I didn't know Hux had it in him." Alan didn't say anything. He simply looked down at Caleb with complete disgust. "I saw him," Caleb said, and there was no hysteria in his voice. He spoke as if every word was true. Trevor brought up his leg for another kick. "No, wait," I said, and bent down to get eye level with Caleb. His face was a mess of blood, snot and tears. I had gone to school with Caleb for years. He had not been a nice kid. He lied and said terrible things, poked at too many people. But there was something about what he said. Maybe he was lying. But what if he wasn't? "What do you mean you saw Larson?" "I saw him," Caleb said hoarsely. "I saw him by the park, not too far from the pond. He was glowing and smiling. He waved to me. I swear he did. I know he's dead, but I saw him." "Oh, give me a break," Trevor said, and he connected another kick with Caleb's stomach. Caleb groaned, and it seemed to me that Mattison was enjoying all this a bit too much. "Stop that," I said, and then shoved Trevor. "What the hell's your problem?" Trevor said in response. He raised one of his fists and his knuckles were flaked with scabs and dry blood, probably from his countless other fights. "You want some of this too?" "Why are you defending him?" Alan said. "Well, what if he's telling the truth?" I knew how ridiculous it sounded the moment the words came out of my mouth, but there was something about Larson's death I couldn't ignore. His body had been discovered by a pond, completely lifeless. There had been no signs of struggle, and so far, no official statement on his death. What if something had gotten Larson? Something terrible, like out of a nightmare or a campfire story. Something that lurks in the dark, but glows when it wants to be seen. "I know this sounds crazy," I said, "but I ran into Larson before he died. He told me he saw his dead dog. He said his dog had been glowing." "You started that?" Alan said, raising an eyebrow. "I thought he was just another BS rumor floating around." "It's true," I said defensively. "I did run into Larson, and he did tell me that, and now Caleb is saying something similar." "Because he heard the rumor," Trevor interjected. "He heard about what Larson said, and now he's trying to spin his own BS on it, to rile people up." "I don't doubt that you did run into Larson," Alan said to me, "and I believe he did tell you that he saw his dead dog. Maybe he was onto something. Maybe he was messing with you. Who knows? There's a lot we don't know about Hal Larson, only that he didn't deserve to die. But Summers here. Summers, I don't believe. Summers is a parasite, and he's trying to disrupt the vigil. That I can't stand." "But what if Caleb's telling the truth too?" I said thoughtfully. "And what if Larson really did see his dead dog, and he went looking for it, and then it got him? And maybe now the same thing that got Larson is pretending to be Larson." Again, I was painfully aware of how ridiculous it all sounded. "You hear what you're saying?" Trevor said. "Larson got done in by something pretending to be his dead dog. You're worse than Summers. At least he knows it's full of crap." "I admit it sounds far-fetched," Chester said, "but I've heard of strange things like this back in Louisiana. There are folklore, legends and such." "Yeah, and maybe the boogeyman is real too," Trevor said mockingly. "In fact, I think I saw Santa Claus last year, only he wasn't delivering presents. He was stooping a hooker behind the convenience store. Ho ho ho." "I don't buy any of it," Alan said. "You're just trying to prevent the inevitable. Summers was going to get his ass beat sooner or later. Stop protecting him." "Well, why don't we just go and check it out?" Owen said. He had been quiet for a while. I could tell he was having trouble with the situation. He didn't like Summers, but Owen wasn't a bad guy, and he wouldn't want someone getting beat up like this, especially if they were telling the truth. Maybe Summers is lying, or maybe he isn't. There's only one way to find out, isn't there? Let's just go to the park and see if anything's there. No one said anything. The only sound was Caleb's pitiful wheezing. Then a look came over Alan. It was a look of regret and shame, as if he finally realized what he and Trevor had been doing. He looked down at Caleb's bloody figure and winced. He looked more like the Boy Scout I knew him to be. "Fine," Alan said soberly. "We'll check it out." He even bent down and helped Caleb to his feet. Caleb tried to push away, but Trevor latched one of his arms around him. "But if there aren't any dead dogs or glowing boys," Trevor said, and another mad smile crossed his face, "then we'll really give you something to talk about, Summers." The six of us made our way out of one of the school's side entrances. We were away from the vigil, which was still going strong. I could hear the sound of the school choir singing. On this side of the neighborhood, there wasn't anyone else in sight. We walked on, with Alan and Trevor in the vanguard, Chester and Caleb in the middle, and Owen and I in the rear. For all the beatings he had taken, Caleb was walking strong. He seemed more composed now. Alan and Trevor would continuously look back at Caleb to make sure he didn't try to run away. "Do you really believe this?" Owen asked me quietly. "I don't know," I said, "but it didn't sound like Caleb was lying." "Yeah, okay, but Pete, if he isn't lying, what the hell are we going to do if we run into this thing?" "Oh," I said a little pathetically, "I guess I don't really know." Owen gave a wild bark of laughter, shook his head, and we walked on. Eventually, we made it to the park, and it was an eerily quiet night. So quiet, in fact, that not even the crickets were chirping. "Well, here we are," Trevor said. "Yoo-hoo! Are there any glowing monsters here?" "I saw him," Caleb said. "He was here. I swear, it was right here." We looked around the park, but there was nothing but darkness. Trevor and Alan began closing in on Caleb like sharks drawn to blood. Could Summers really have been lying about it all? Is he really just a pest, trying to stir things up? Did he come to the vigil just to mess with everybody, to dance on Larson's grave? "You said it was glowing, Summers. You said you saw Larson and he was glowing. Show us, damn it. Show us, or these guys are going to break you in two." "Well, there ain't no one else here but us, sunshine," Trevor said. "We're tired of your lies, Summer," Alan said darkly. "He was here. I saw him. I saw him," Caleb said in a panicky voice. Sweat had broken out on his face, and the rivulet streaked through the dried blood. "Guys, come on," I said, but Owen placed a hand on my shoulder and shook his head. Hugs was 6'3" and nothing but muscle. Mattison had years of experience of getting into dirty brawls. I wouldn't be able to stop them any more than I could stop the sun from rising each morning. And now Caleb Summers was going to get it. "What's going on here?" We all turned toward the sound of the voice. There was a policeman walking down the road toward us. Caleb didn't waste a moment. With Alan and Trevor distracted, he immediately ran the other direction into the dark. He was gone in seconds. "Alan Hooks, is that you?" the officer said when he finally got near enough. Every cop in town knew Alan Hooks. He was the star of our high school, the pride of our little perfect town. "Mattison, is that you too?" Every cop also knew Trevor Mattison, though obviously for different reasons. "It's me, sir," Alan said. "What are you boys doing out here?" the officer said, eyeing the five of us suspiciously. He seemed just as surprised as I had been to see Hooks and Mattison together. "We just left the vigil," Alan said. "We're all heading home." "Is that right?" the cop said, scratching his nose. "Who's that other boy I saw? The one that ran off?" "Other boy?" Mattison said innocently. "What other boy? You fellas see another boy here?" He looked at us, and there was a glare in his eyes, a glare that said, "Don't you say a damn thing." All right, enough, Mattison," the officer said, somewhat darkly. "I sure as hell don't know what's going on here, but you boys go home now. There's no curfew yet, but that might change. Go on now." The officer made a shooing motion with the back of his hand, and the five of us started down the road. Eventually, Alan and Trevor split off from us and disappeared like wraiths in the night. "You almost made me believe, Pete," Owen said when it was just the three of us left. "Can you imagine if something had shown up in the park?" "It'll get worse for Summers now," Chester said bleakly. "Hugs and Mattison won't let this go. They'll tell others what Summers said tonight. It's going to get real bad for him." "He needs to stop stirring things up," Owen said. "I mean, coming to Larson's vigil tonight, saying the things he said. What did he think was going to happen?" At that, Chester and I merely shook our heads. What had Caleb Summers been thinking? What did he hope to achieve by being such an annoying pest? Was it some kind of retaliation for the way he'd been treated by others this week? Didn't he realise that he was making things infinitely worse? Why would he lie about seeing Larson in the park? Couldn't he feel the fervour that was taking over the school? The town even? Didn't he know people were upset about Larson's death? Not just the tragedy, but the mystery of it all. Didn't he understand that Larson's death was a blotch on our perfect little town, and people were screaming for answers, screaming for justice? I saw him. He was glowing. Things did get worse for Caleb Summers after all. Hugs and Mattison told people about Caleb's antics at the vigil, and word spread very fast. If he hadn't been already, then there was no doubt that Caleb was now public enemy number one as far as our high school was concerned. More and more people started shoving him in the hallway. Teachers who would normally put a stop to that simply looked the other way. Once, while walking down the hall, I even saw Mr. Rathers bump into Caleb. He bumped him so hard that Caleb nearly fell over. Mr. Rathers didn't even acknowledge Caleb, he simply kept walking. And as for Caleb himself, well, he looked like a walking ghoul. His face and body were bruised from the beating Alan and Trevor had given him the other day. His skin had gone a sickly pale from all the stress, and his eyes were constantly narrowed as if he was always expecting some sort of attack. He didn't speak much either. He simply kept his head down, only darting his eyes up every once in a while to make sure no one was coming behind him. Caleb was once a lively person who would often say terrible or nasty things, but now he was like a scarecrow, a walking scarecrow that said nothing, a scarecrow that constantly looked over its shoulders for fear of having its straw ripped out. "Did you hear what Summer said at the vigil? Can you believe it? He said he killed Larson, admitted it right out in the open. I heard he had a bomb on him. He was planning on taking everyone out right there and then. Summers said he's going to do it again. Who do you think will get it next? Summers, man. Watch out for Summers. Oh Jesus, oh Jesus. Glowing. He was glowing." Worst of all, Caleb Summers was alone. He had no friends, no confidants, no one to protect him in any way. He was on an island, surrounded by sharks, hundreds of them. Owen and Chester had cautioned me against trying to comfort Caleb or help him in any way, for fear that some of Caleb's would-be attackers would turn their attention to me, especially since I was the one that started the rumour about Larson saying he saw his dead dog. No grief ever got back to me though. It only ever was targeted at Caleb. I still felt bad for him, even though he had lied about seeing Larson in the park. Did he lie though? Are you still sure that he lied, Pete? Are you okay with what's happening right now? I wasn't okay with it. There was a part of me that still believed Caleb, believed that he had seen Larson in the park days after he had died, the same way Larson had seen his dead dog. There was something lurking in our town, lurking in the shadows, and it was preying on people, but no one was noticing it. No one but Larson and Caleb. It was Caleb versus the rest of the school for days on end. Caleb couldn't even take the school bus anymore. The kids on there would crowd around and gang up on him, and the bus driver would simply whistle and keep on driving. He had to run home at the end of every school day. Some kids would follow him on bikes and throw things at him. It was terrifying how quickly people had turned on Caleb. "We know it was you, Summers. We know it was you. What were Larson's last words, killer? What did he say? Why'd you come to the vigil, Summers? Why'd you come to the vigil? Oh Jesus, I'm next. I'm next. Glowing, I swear he was glowing. Someone should put an end to Summers." Throughout it all, Caleb never said anything, never fought back. He took their jeers and punches in the chin. He simply trucked on, like a scarecrow floating down a river. It didn't matter how many stones the scarecrow ran into, or how many branches it got snagged on. It simply kept floating down the river, even as it lost all its straw. Eventually, Caleb ran out of straw. He was found dead just a couple weeks after Hal Larson had died. His body had been found not too far from the park, where he claimed he saw Larson the night of the vigil. According to the reports, his death was eerily identical to that of Larson as well. There were no indications of how he died, no signs of a struggle. He had a couple of scrapes and bruises from his continuous tormentors, but other than that, it was as if the life had been sucked out of him. At first, I thought that maybe one of my classmates had taken things too far, that Hooks or Matterson had finally decided to give Caleb what he deserved once and for all, had decided to put an end to Caleb Ratboy Summers. But I knew that wasn't true. No one from my school killed Caleb, not directly at least. Caleb had been killed by the same thing that killed Hal Larson, a thing that lurked in the shadows. It seemed to glow as well, a thing that could take the appearance of a dead dog or a dead schoolboy. But in some ways, maybe my school was still responsible. Maybe they had picked on Caleb one too many times. Maybe Caleb went searching for that thing that lurked in the shadows, hoping it would put him out of his misery. In the end, it had. Caleb Summers was dead. After Caleb's death, our school closed down for a couple of days, and a strict curfew was put in place. A strange thing happened after his death. It was as if the violent fervour everyone had against Caleb had broke, and a sort of shame and disgust had overcome my classmates. Shame for how they had treated him. Yet, even though their shame was clear to see on their faces, none of them would admit to how badly they had treated Caleb. Poor Caleb, he was such a nice guy. He was an angel, wasn't he? Can't believe he died. I hung out with him at Larson's vigil. Nicest guy in the world. Let's pour our toast for Summers. To Caleb Summers. Oh Jesus, I'm next. They're pretending like it never happened, Owen said to Chester and I one day. We were hanging out in my backyard. The curfew wouldn't be for another hour. Like Summers wasn't on top of everyone's hit list for weeks on end. We're guilty in all this, Chester drawled. We should have listened to you, Pete. We should have stuck up for Caleb. It all went too far. It doesn't matter now, I said glumly. Do you think whatever got Larson, got Caleb, the glowy thing? Chester asked, and there was a clear fear in his eyes. I simply nodded. After that, Chester left, saying he had to be home. It was just Owen and I, and for a while, neither of us spoke. Then Owen said, Did I ever tell you I was best friends with Summer when we were kids? I shook my head. It's true. Back in elementary school, before you boys moved here, I used to hang out with him all the time on the weekends. Our houses aren't that far apart. He got me a pop gun for one of my birthdays. Can you believe that? I still have it somewhere, buried in my room. The strange thing is, I can't remember why we stopped being friends. It's just a blur to me, Pete. One day we were friends, and the next day we weren't. One day I was hanging out with him, and the next day I was hanging out with you and Chester. Why? Why did kids stop being friends with each other? Why did they stop, Pete? When did he stop being Caleb Summers to me and become Rat Boy? I wish I could say sorry to him. God, I am sorry. I'm sorry too, was all I could say. Eventually, Owen left. It got dark and curfew set in. The stars were out and the moon was bright. There was a small open field behind my house. I was going to go inside when something caught my eyes. There was someone standing in the field. It was Caleb Summers, and he was glowing. Caleb, is that you? I said in shock. I hopped my backyard's fence and ran into the field. It was Caleb. His skin was white and there was a glow to him. He was waving at me and he was smiling, gesturing for me to come closer. I felt as if I were in a trance. I needed to get closer to him. I had to get closer. Caleb, I can't believe it's Caleb. And then it happened. Caleb Summers vanished. What was standing in the field instead was something black and oozy like tar, with tentacles like a squid. It had red eyes and they glared at me hungrily. One of its tentacles made a swoop at me, but I quickly jumped back. I gave a shout and then ran back to my house. I jumped over the fence, ran inside the back door of my house and locked it. I fell against the door, gasping. I knew instantly what I had just encountered. It had been the thing that killed Hal Larson and Caleb Summers. The thing that lurked in the shadows of our perfect little town. I had only survived because it had mistakenly dissolved its illusion a moment too soon. Had it pretended to be Caleb for only a second longer. Eventually, our little perfect town went back to normal. School and life resumed. No one died for the rest of the school year, and during the summer, I found out my father had gotten a job in California. We moved away from that town. Owen, Chester and I said we would always stay in touch, but eventually that stopped, and I lost contact with them. I haven't spoken to them in years. I never forget about them though, or about Hal Larson or Caleb Summers. Part of me wants to go back to that perfect little town, see if Owen and Chester are still there. I wonder what they've been up to all these years. But another part of me is afraid. Afraid that when I walk those streets at night, I'll see something glowing in the dark. And it'll be Caleb Summers waving at me. Caleb Summers smiling and glowing. You make bones out of sand. Hot blood turns into glass. When flesh grows in, invited from the parts of the earth that keep such secrets, a trek through the desert will temper the bones. Like everything else, it starts out fragile. It would have seemed poetic in a way if it hadn't come from the little girl I was sitting across from on the subway. It was actually disturbing as a small, bright face looked at me as she spoke. I looked at her mother, or who I assumed was her mother anyway, and expected something to be said. She just looked down at her phone, scrolling with her thumb intermittently. I looked left and right to see if any other people had heard and were as off-put as I was, but the semi-full subway car didn't carry another person that was paying attention to anything outside themselves. Just me. Me and the little girl that spoke of glass and bones. I opened my mouth but couldn't decide what to say, so I shut it again and pressed my lips into a thin, polite smile. I'd never been good with people, not strangers anyway, and that was under normal circumstances. This didn't feel like normal circumstances. The little girl smiled back and kicked her legs back and forth as she sat on a seat. Unease spread through my body as I looked up away from the child and tried to force my tense muscles to ease up, relax. We passed an intersection at just the right speed for me to catch a glimpse down it. I could see the tunnel of fluorescent lights and tracks going on and on out of sight. It was gone in an instant. I didn't know that there were places where the tracks crossed in the subway, but then again, I'd never ridden one until I moved not long ago. I was still acclimating to public transport as my last home didn't have much to offer. The image of the tunnel, an unexpected gaping hole in the wall, stuck in my head. It's not really like that. My attention snapped back down to the little girl when she spoke again. My stomach tensed up as I looked at her. I tried to push away the feeling like I had done so many times, trying to swallow my anxiety away. My eyes flickered to her mother again, but she was still concentrating on her phone. What's that, sweetie? I regretted the words as soon as they left my mouth. First of all, calling a random little girl sweetie made me cringe a little, but on top of that, I found myself dreading her response. The subway, it's not like this. Oh, okay. My impulse to try and carry on the conversation to be polite was crushed by my growing unease. It had started as a small bloom in my stomach, but it was vining out and starting to cling to my insides, making my muscles feel like they were forming knots. I smiled again, but it didn't feel polite. It felt desperate. I tried to casually glance around, but once again nobody was paying attention to me or the little girl. I reached into my sweater pocket for the small paperback I usually kept on me. The book was usually a good excuse to keep your head down and keep to yourself. I didn't know if it would dissuade the little girl, but I had to try. My stop wasn't for a while yet. In fact, there wasn't any stop for a while yet, so I knew for certain I would be stuck with her until then. I read a paragraph in my book once, twice, 3 times. I couldn't focus or remember what I read. It's like the words were whispered from far away by my internal voice, and I just couldn't make them out. I sighed, now frustrated on top of everything else, and looked up. Not at the little girl, no, but above her, out the window. We passed another crossing, another tunnel running through the one I was currently gliding down, and I remembered that I never noticed them before. I hadn't been on many trips yet, sure, but it began to seem odd. I put it down to usually being able to read my book with no issue, keeping to myself. Do you want to know about the secret places where flesh is reborn? I didn't even bother looking at her mother for a reaction, or anyone else for that matter. I realized that this child and I were effectively alone in the subway car. I wanted to scream, just to see if anyone else would look at me, but I took a breath instead. The thought was ridiculous, of course, and I wanted nothing less than to cause a scene. Excuse me. The tremor in my voice did not deter the little girl's happy face and wide, sparkling eyes. Everything comes from somewhere. The sand, the blood, the flesh. You have to know where to gather the ingredients. I don't understand, but I don't want to talk about this. I was more forceful than intended, but hoped I got my point across. Children don't offer heed to subtlety anyway. I turned my face back to my book pointedly, to find a small, black beetle sitting on my wrist. I jumped, dropping my book, and shook it off. I brushed my clothes to make sure it wasn't still clinging to me somewhere, and a sense of revulsion joined my growing panic. I then wished more than ever I had gotten a prescription from my doctor that tied me over in my new home. Getting into an office as a patient was more problematic than expected, and I had leaned on my scant supply of anxiety meds to get me through interviews. You have to go to the deep, dark places where the sun doesn't reach and the soil is fertilized by the remains of the giants. I tried to pick up my book, but just looking at the floor made me dizzy. I was afraid if I leaned over, I would succumb to the nausea that was intensifying with every click of the tracks. I looked up as we passed another tunnel, another intersection, another long, empty corridor, and it raised goosebumps on my arms when I realized it was different. It was shorter, darker. The quality of the lights were degraded and they flickered. I realized I saw too much for a passing glance, and my stomach dropped. How did I see so much as fast as we were going? I watched the walls zip by like usual. Do you know how deep the subways are? Do you know how deep this subway is? I didn't want to look at her, but I had to. I couldn't stop my body from casting my eyes down to her. She hadn't changed at all. Nothing in the subway car but me ever changed at all. And just looking at her beautiful little face made my blood run cold. I pictured blue blood, starved of oxygen, flooding around glass bones inside my body, and I hated my own brain for creating the thought. It was getting hard to breathe. Do you count the steps down from the surface? She asked while smiling to expose her neat, square little teeth that had 2 missing spaces along the top row. I don't. But that was a lie. I counted every time. I've always counted stairs and ceiling tiles and daisy petals. It felt like I was always counting something just to keep my mind from spiraling away from me. I tried to remember how many steps there were from the surface to the subway. How many steps did it take for the sunlight to transition into the dim, lifeless bulbs below the earth? I couldn't remember. I couldn't think of it, though I'd done it a dozen or so times by then. I noticed that, in the back of my mind, I was still counting. I'd never really stopped counting since I left the sidewalk. I shook my head to try and erase the countdown, my awareness of it. I tried to will it away, but the numbers, ever growing, stuck to my consciousness. Spite lasts. It lasts like nothing else does. I put my face in my hands, but the girl didn't stop. Do you know what kind of spite trickles down from the giants having a whole world taken from them? A paradise to be ruined? Spite that sits in the earth longer than the bones do. It festers and brews and feeds. Hey, is this your daughter? I practically shouted at the woman, engrossed in a phone, but she didn't even startle, let alone look up or answer me. It feeds on fear. The girl didn't stop talking in a childish but even tone. It's a voice that now fills me with terror, that threatens to leap from my throat. Hey, anybody! I shouted down the subway car, one way, then the other. Is anybody else hearing this? Can any of you hear me? Nobody answered, or moved, or so much as sniffed in annoyance at my outburst. Spite digests fear like stomach acid digests food, and the earth creates flesh like a womb. I look out the window, desperate for any sign that we were nearing my stop. I thought to myself that this just has to stop. It has to. Please, just something make it stop. All I saw was another identical but unfamiliar tunnel. It was shorter. It was darker. It felt like not just another direction for trains to follow, but this whole other place. No, it wasn't a place, but a thing that was drawing closer and closer the longer I sat there. It felt malevolent, and my heart was then hammering inside my chest, my skin prickling with anticipation for something unidentifiable and horrible that was bearing down on me, on everyone in the subway car, if they existed at all. But why would I even think that? Of course they exist, I told myself. I looked down to see more beetles in my hands, and I shook them off frantically. My skin was crawling so viscerally, I hadn't even noticed the bugs at first. I don't want this. It was practically a sob as the words came unbidden out of my mouth. You don't get to choose. A god is forming. A great, horrible god is eating and growing and waiting. The girl laughed, but it was humourless. It wasn't mocking or cruel. It was just a sound that reverberated in my brain, threatening to break apart the tenuous grasp I had on reality. Or at least what I thought had to be reality, because it couldn't be that. No, it couldn't be that horrible subway car full of people who couldn't hear me, and a little girl that certainly didn't act like a little girl. Another gaping hole in the wall appeared across from me, through the window. I couldn't tell if my skin was just prickling from terror, or if the feeling of movement on my face was tears, or if it was all beetles, but I couldn't bring myself to look away from that tunnel. I just clawed at my clothes and hair as I was transfixed by the gaping void across from me. It wasn't even pretending to be a tunnel anymore. The break in the subway was jagged, and the hole was darker, yet more alive. The broken subway tiles were like teeth, and the flickering lights more like the wet glistening of the inside of a mouth. That's when I finally screamed. I screamed as we passed the horrible hole in the subway wall. I stood and screamed and brushed more black beetles from my body and screamed. I screamed so hard that my vision went blurry from the effort. I screamed so long I went deaf to the sound of it. Spite fueled by fear will feed a god to break anything unbroken, a god of vengeance. The little girl's voice seemed so far away, but it stirred something inside of me. Suddenly, I didn't have the energy to be afraid anymore. The terror had burned up everything inside me. The anxiety and the stress and the confusion had completely fried my brain. I didn't even realize I'd stopped screaming until I noticed that I could hear the rhythmic clicking of the tracks again. I sat back down, suddenly calm. This was either real or it wasn't, but either way, I needed to protect myself. There was no way out, so I did the only thing that years of all sorts of anxiety and a fair amount of trauma had taught me to do. I shut down. I disassociated. Like a clockwork doll, my gears shut down one by one from head to toe, and the world around me, whatever world it was, became a poorly painted stage I was nothing more than a prop on. Had everyone else already been pushed this far? Is that why they didn't respond? The little girl's legs stopped swinging. What are you doing? Her tone changed for the first time since she had spoken about the bones made of sand. It seemed like hours ago by then. Maybe a whole day. I'm sorry. I dropped my book. My voice itself sounded like an afterthought, monotone, as I numbly reached to the floor. As I grasped my book, several black beetles fell from my sleeve with their legs curled against their bodies. I dusted off the cover. There we go. I didn't really mean to do or say anything. My body was on autopilot, subway mode activated. The earth is full of boiling blood from creatures ages older than your earliest ancestors. Oh? I cracked open my book. Just an extra in a play, acting out their role as a weekday commuter. The anxiety left and had taken most of my senses with it. You'll all be ruled by an incredible monster. The little girl started yelling and stood on a seat. You'll succumb to an ancient stomach. She may as well have been quiet radio static crackling across from me. I could hear her, but I couldn't process the words in any meaningful way. Everything but basic functioning was turned off. I barely realized I should care, and even that dwindled away. I turned the page of my book, having not read a word. I started counting until it was reasonable for a person actually reading to need to turn another page. I counted to 100, then proceeded as if I had read every sentence. What are you doing? It was her turn to sound scared, maybe angry. It was hard to tell. I looked up, and she was then blocking the window, but I glanced ahead anyway, as if I could see through her, and I could barely see anything from the haze of my own defense mechanism. I just noticed the wall flitting by in my peripheral vision. I looked back down at my book and started counting to the next page. It felt like my organa and bone and brain were wrapped up in cotton. Everything was dampened, muted. It was a comforting feeling. So many times in school, with my family, work, college, in public, I shut down to protect myself and get through whatever horror was happening around me. I heard the girl, or whatever she was, thump back down in her seat. A familiar hiss reached my ears that signified my stop was approaching. I closed my book and put it in my back pocket. I folded my hands in my lap and stared ahead with a polite smile stuck into place. Default, innocuous, a carefully crafted expression as did not invite any attention. The girl's hand suddenly shot out and gripped my arm, incredibly firm for such a small hand, but I didn't so much as flinch. I was used to much harsher treatment from much larger hands. I learned to not react decades ago. Reacting makes it worse, whatever may be coming. Shut down, endure, survive. You won't stay with me? She sounded more like a little girl than she had the whole time. A real little girl. I'm sorry, sweetie. My fake customer service voice dripped from her mouth. This is my stop and I have to go to work, but it's been nice talking to you. I didn't mean any of it, but I didn't have to. But her mother, or whatever it was, finally came to life at that. She pulled the child back into a seat. Come on, hon, leave the nice person alone. It's time for them to go. Maybe next time you'll make a friend that stays longer. The woman smiled at me as I stood and grabbed my things. I mirrored it back at her. I heard the subway car doors open and I moved towards them. It wasn't until I was out and moving quickly to the stairs that my brain allowed me to register what I had seen on my way out. Every other person in the car, every single person who wasn't me, the girl or a mother, was a corpse. They were in various states of decay, and the more advanced ones were writhing with black beetles. When I was finally in the sunlight and the open air, finally out of that bizarre hellscape, finally out of that disgusting mass grave, I vomited. There was no bush or trash can to throw up into, so I pitched forward and heaved hard several times until my stomach was completely empty. Then I fled. I didn't want to be aware of anyone or anything around me. I just walked as quickly as I could towards my job. Work. I felt like that would be safe and I could breathe. I just needed to get to work and everything would be okay and the nightmare would be over. I finally walked into the front doors and it was like walking into a whole new, clean atmosphere, and I could breathe deeply for the first time since I boarded the subway and sat amongst the... I couldn't even think about that though. Whatever it had been. I couldn't let myself think about the trip, or the doctor's appointments I needed, or the therapy I needed, or the exorcism. I didn't have the time or the energy to sort out any of that. Who would believe anything I said? I took a deep breath and started heading to my desk. Hey, early as always. My cubicle neighbour made his way toward me. I looked up and tried to smile, but I must have faltered because his face turned down just a hair. Are you okay? Can I get you a drink? He gestured with his mug of coffee. Yeah, I'm okay. Thank you though. Just a rough subway ride. I laughed as if to brush it off, but it sounded hollow to me. Thinking about a trip from your old job? His eyebrows seemed to arch impossibly high on his head. No, just now, but it's fine. I just want to get to work. I smiled winningly to assure him that I was indeed okay. Instead, he frowned even harder. We don't... He lowered his voice and came a bit closer. We don't have a subway around here. I felt cold all over in an instant. What did I say? I meant food. I hit up Subway for breakfast on my way over. I hoped with every particle of my being that there was actually a decently local Subway sandwich shop. It was a hassle, not worth it. Okay, if you're sure. He considered me for a silent moment, but apparently figured whatever I was going through was harmless. Why don't I grab you a bottle of water? Sure, that would be great. Thanks. I walked back to my desk on numb legs and sat down. I was frozen for a moment. I let myself count to 30, and after that I had to get moving. No subway here? I'd ridden it over a dozen times. I killed the thought before it could awaken new panic. For 30 seconds, I just sat like a dummy again, pushing everything unnecessary out of my mind. Then I turned on my computer and started unpacking my things. Once everything was in its place for the day, I reached into my sweater pocket. The book was more than just for emergency reading. It was a comfort. It helped ground me when everything else felt wrong. Some people have worry stones or stress balls or jewelry to fiddle with. I ruffled the pages of a worn paperback. It was gone. I'd either dropped it in the... or it fell out of my pocket when I'd been throwing up. Either way, it was gone, and I felt a bit naked. It was still my probationary period at work, so I couldn't just beg to go home early, but I still considered it for a moment when my fingers met the inside seam of my pocket with no resistance. I took another breath and logged into my computer. The rest of the day went on perfectly normal. No giants, no bones, no gods. My neighbour seemed pleased in the positive turn in my mental state since that morning. There was no trouble, nothing that made me question existence or my sanity. Near the end of my shift, I started getting nervous though. Part of me wanted to know what would be there if I walked to the subway that my co-workers said didn't exist. I couldn't bring myself to Google it, not at work, not before I could really rest and recover. I was getting on by willpower alone, and it was quickly fading. I felt like it was made out of a soap bubble, and the slightest tremor would destroy me. I felt like my brain would pop with any more stress. I scheduled an Uber to pick me up instead. That also went well, as they didn't talk, and I stared at my phone the whole time. As the driver pulled up to my apartment building, I could almost convince myself that the whole thing had been an extremely vivid nightmare I had on the way to work. The subway existing or not, who knows? Maybe I was walking the whole time and just made up the subway to protect myself. I knew that didn't make sense, but I didn't care. I was beyond exhausted. I just wanted a hot shower and my bed. No, I needed an extremely hot shower, and then to fall into a sleep, damn near like a coma. I unlocked my apartment door and pushed it open. I heard something scrape across the floor, and I looked down, just to have panic flood through me all over again. Fresh, ice-cold terror washed away any other thoughts as I looked at the floor. It was my book. The one I had lost on whatever journey I had taken. It was covered with dirt. Nearly pitch black, damp earth clung to it, as if it was excavated from a grave. A little black beetle trundled out from between the pages. I was sitting on a park bench, minding my own business, when I heard someone knock on the air next to me. At first, I thought it was someone that had hit a baseball with a bat nearby, and the sound had travelled. But it was rainy, and approaching midnight. There wouldn't have been anyone outside playing baseball. I'd just gotten off work, and decided to have a seat at the park that I must pass on my way home. There's a tree directly over the bench that had shielded me from most of the rain. When I dismissed the first thought for the sound's origin, the second, my brain still clinging to rational explanations, arrived. It had been a gunshot. I'd never heard a gunshot before, not one in real life, but it seemed plausible at the time. This, of course, put me on edge. I was alone, unarmed, and still had about 1.5 miles on my walk home. The park held several towering trees, and the lights placed intermittently throughout the park did little to dispel the darkness and shadows abound. Anyone could easily hide beneath the umbrage of the trees, completely hidden with a clear view of me, since a light pole stood just by the bench. I scanned the area trying to discern some human-shaped object in the darkness, but saw nothing beyond the form of trees and some other recognizable park paraphernalia, fountains, benches, trash cans, etc. Of course, any of these objects could hide or partially conceal a human body if they had mind to hide themselves. I peered through the darkness for what felt like ages, but saw nothing. The sound did not repeat, and in my burgeoning fright, I tried to tell myself that it couldn't have been a gunshot, that if someone had fired a gun, they would have fired a second shot to ensure that their victim was dead. That aiming accurately in the darkness would be incredibly difficult. With this panic-conceived rationalization, I gave up my scrutiny of the shadows, picked up my bag, and began walking the rest of the way home. I passed the boundaries of the park, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds to ensure that no one was following me. Once I had gone past several intersections without spotting anyone, I calmed down a bit and slowed my walk to a more casual stroll. The rain continued on, unrelenting, but my hood kept most of the water from my face. I was utterly soaked though, and silently thanked whatever power bestows luck, because I wouldn't have been able to flee from my pursuer with such heavily drenched clothing. When I reached the corner, just as I rounded it, I heard the same sound. That short, concussive knock right at the left side of my face. I flinched, stopping in place as I did so, but my eyes had stayed slightly open. There was nothing at the corner, no one down the sidewalk, and yet the sound had seemed to come from directly next to me. The streetlights that lined the way illuminated a bare and soaked sidewalk. I took a tentative step down that way and became suddenly aware of how audible my footsteps were as the water sloshed about within the soles of my shoes. I realized that there couldn't have possibly been anyone near me. I would have heard them, even if I hadn't seen them. All the shops along the sidewalk were closed, the signs that said such faced the street, the neon shapes or letters dimmed or completely off. The street to the right was devoid of cars, and the line of shops across it were equally inactive. I was alone, and yet I had the feeling that something was around, some invisible presence. Certifiably unsettled, but also fearing pneumonia, I continued on. All the stores, most of which I had visited at some point, seemed to blend together into a single and darkened structure as I sped by. I wasn't running, but I wouldn't call my movement walking either. A stuttery, almost skipping gait that probably looked laughably ridiculous, but I didn't care. With each second, that indiscernible presence seemed to draw closer. I finally reached the block on which my apartment complex sat and slowed my walk. I was fairly tired, the rain having made the last stretch an exhaustive exertion. My building loomed ahead, just across the street. There is a gated side entrance, but it can only be exited by a motion-activated sensor on the other side, not entered. I had to go around the corner and head to the front of the complex, and use my key to go through the sidewalk gate. I just made it across the street when the knock happened again, this time right in front of me. I recoiled away, almost slipping and falling backwards. There was nothing up ahead, nothing that could have produced the sound. My heart rate increased, nearly to the point of tachycardia, and I became hyper-aware of myself and surroundings. Adrenaline kicked in, and my body tensed itself in preparation for an encounter. I had never felt this way before. So instinctive, so primal, so terrified. The next knock came suddenly, more sudden than the others I mean, and despite my physiological changes, it took me off guard. It had come from behind, and I practically lurched forward, cursing loudly as I threw my hands out to prevent myself from falling into my face. I quickly scrambled to my feet and turned around, but, as you probably guessed, there was nothing there. Nothing that I could see. I had become completely oblivious to the rain. My clothes were totally saturated, my hood matted down to my head. All worries of sickness due to exposure to the weather were totally ejected. All I could think about, and I wouldn't even call it intelligent thought, was the thing prowling around, knocking on the air around me. Another step towards home, and then another, a third, fourth. 10 steps later, another knock came. This time, I actually felt the dispersed air. It hit my face, an invisible shockwave. I continued on, now running, mindful of and thankful for the rain which mixed in with my tears. I didn't want to be seen crying. To be seen hurrying away from an invisible pursuer, flinching every few seconds, would be embarrassing enough. I reached the gate, key in hand, and unlocked it. I slowed my pace, but still kept up a jog, weaving through the parked cars in the lot. A corner rounded, a set of stairs climbed, and I was at my building. I slowed to a walk, finally reaching the corridor at the end, of which sat my apartment. Just before I reached the door, another knock sounded. This time, it was unmistakable, because it, the force or thing which before it struck the air, had now hit me, right in the forehead. It felt like a punch, a solid, closed fist strike to my cranium. It sent me backwards, and I slipped on the water I had trailed into the once dry corridor. I fell on my back, hard, but luckily had some instinctive sense to keep my head up at the last second. Nonetheless, my vision briefly became blurry. The light fixture overhead seemed to expand, throwing its illumination in wavering rays upon the space around me. I leaned forward, expecting to see some manifestation of the thing which had chased me for nearly 3 miles, but all I saw was the door to my apartment. There were no footprints, no puddles made by someone other than me. Slowly, as to not make myself even dizzier, I rose to my feet. I listened for the faintest sound that would indicate the presence of something else in the corridor, or descending the stairs that led to it, but all was quiet. Even the noises of the rain were muffled to the point of inaudibility. To all my regular senses, I was alone. And yet, I had undoubtedly been punched in the face. Despite my home being just a few feet away, I didn't want to enter. Didn't want to lead the presence into my apartment, where it could haunt and harass me to no end. Some vague intuition told me that it wasn't right in front of me, that I could safely put my back to the apartment's door and gaze down the corridor towards the stairs. I was cold, still soaking wet and tired, but I didn't dare kneel or assume a position of rest. I needed to be alert, as perceptive as possible. I wasn't sure what to do if I saw someone or something, but I wanted to be as ready as the circumstances would allow. Eventually, I sensed the approach of the unseen entity, not with vision or sound, but an inner prescience, some deeper extrasensory perception that picked up on some physically imperceptible signal, an ability I believe intrinsic to everyone, capable of being unconsciously utilized during moments of such unique and preternatural territory. The entity, I sensed, was coming from my left through the solid concrete wall of the corridor. As fast as I could, encumbered by my waterlogged clothing, I dodged to the right. Sure enough, I heard that all too familiar knock and felt the air shift just beside my face. I just narrowly dodged another punch aimed at my head. I've never been a fighter, never even had a physical confrontation, but something awoke in me that night. Instead of simply fleeing and waiting the next attack, I repositioned myself to strike and threw the best punch I could muster, aimed towards the general area at which I had sensed the entity. And my fist struck something solid, something a few feet from the wall, seemingly in midair. A sort of triumph overcame me, and following that was a short-lived but impassioned fury. I swung again and again, striking the invisible assailant with successive blows. Most were feeble, considering my exhaustion, but there were many of them. I pummeled it with both hands until my knuckles hurt. I heard no sound, and while the surfaces my fists made contact with seemed to shift, as if it were attempting to block my blows, it did not try to retaliate. I don't think it could. I don't think anyone had ever managed to fight back. The final blow landed on what I was sure was its head, and I finally let my arms fall. I panted, more soaked in sweat than water, and stepped back a few feet. The adrenaline and anger had begun to wear off, and I felt the post-violence fatigue slowly encroach upon my body and stiffen my limbs. Outside, the rain picked up, and flashes of lightning illuminated the dimly lit corridor. In one brief flash, I saw a humanoid figure hanging limply from the surface of the wall, as if fused within the concrete. Its body was mostly translucent, barely identifiable as anything other than a figure, an outline. For a moment, I stared with the satisfaction of one who has defeated a formidable opponent. I had no idea of what it was, and hadn't been able to see it, and yet I'd won. This satisfaction lasted for a few seconds. Before my eyes, the thing rose from its incapacitated state, still attached to the wall. It raised its face to me, and I fell back against the opposite wall, utterly petrified by the infernal image before me. Its face was caved in, and the blackness within seemed depthless. Its torso was opened vertically, creating a massive trench from forehead to navel. The cavernous blackness of this body opening seemed to drink the corridor's light. I felt myself, some spiritual part of me, being drawn into that abysmal orifice. Just as I thought it would swallow me, entombing me in that awful darkness, another flash of lightning lit up the corridor, and the image disappeared. The air, which before had taken on a stifled heaviness, grew light again, and my nerves eased up almost immediately. With the same higher sense that had anticipated the creature, I knew that it had departed, gone back to its Stygian realm, wherever that may be. The blow to my head still hurt as I stumbled to my apartment. I wouldn't have consciously survived another. I don't know why I was chosen as its prey, but I'd beaten it, driven it back to immateriality. Now, days later, I occasionally see others on my walks to and from work, and though I no longer hear the knocks, I sometimes see people flinch, seemingly for no reason at all, as they go about their business. They look around, confused, then carry on, eyes glancing here and there. If the source of their distraction is what I suspect, I hope they have the courage and resilience to face it as I did. I'm sure that it would have taken me to some awful, dark-choked sub-existence if I hadn't fought back. I felt an unreal despair in that brief vision of its half-manifested form, a soul-blighting experience that I've still yet to fully recover from. I wouldn't wish such a black and dreadful fate upon anyone. When you live in the middle of nowhere, you have to get used to certain things. When you live in a town like Prodigy, that only gets more true. Sometimes, a cow will go missing from a field in the middle of the night. Other times, someone will come across roadkill strung out across the length of the road from one ditch to another, with pieces missing. Occasionally, when people leave their trucks on the 2 tracks in the middle of fields during harvest, they would come back to a tipped truck or even ruined tyres. The town, officially, chalked it up to some naughty city kids, or even some of the teenagers in town, running around and wreaking havoc. Unofficially, we all knew something else was going on, but no one had ever seen it. There's always a story though, especially in Prodigy. I guess it was only a matter of time before someone ran into it. The night we first saw the thing in the fields, it started out like any other. I was only 15 at the time, but Oliver was 16 with a full driver's license and everything. I don't know if you know anything about what teenagers in small towns do for fun, but if you do, then you probably know that the #1 pastime is to get in a car with your friends and cruise until you run out of gas. All we had in Prodigy were fields and long, winding dirt roads, so it made sense to put them to use. Most of the time, we would blast music over the stereo, buy some snacks at the gas station, and joke around all night. Sometimes we would drive out past all the houses, way past the feedlot, and park somewhere on the side of the road before climbing up on top of Oliver's truck and looking at the stars. The only difference, I assume, is that kids in Prodigy are usually a little more aware of where they are and what's around them when they're out in the middle of a field after dark. Prairie kids around here know that, usually, you aren't the only thing out there. Most of the time, it's just a deer or a loose cow or even a coyote. Sometimes, it's not. You just learn how to be careful, and you usually don't go by yourself. At this time in my life, it was nice to get away sometimes, laying in the bed of Oliver's truck or climbing up on top and looking at the stars while we blasted classic rock through the open windows was a preferable way of spending my time. Usually, Jay and Logan would come with us, and the four of us would have a blast out there by ourselves until we absolutely had to go home. That night though, it was just me and Oliver as we drove through town, past the, still inexplicably scorched, site of the old church, and coasted along what felt like 100 different dirt roads. Jay was babysitting, Logan had work, normal stuff. We weren't exactly bothering to keep quiet. The last house we had passed was at least 10 miles back, probably more. We had settled into our routine of playing music through the truck stereo as we got comfortable on the blankets that I had brought in the bed of Oliver's truck, talking and yelling jokes and howling in laughter. His stereo had Bluetooth, so we could listen to whatever we wanted through his phone without having to climb around a million times to change the radio station or rotate CDs. We did leave the window at the back of his truck open though, mostly so we could snag a phone charger through it. We sat in the bed of his truck for nearly an hour before I started to feel weird about something. I like to think that, in most situations, I have pretty good intuition. My mom has always described me as a good judge of character, but I'm not sure that's all it is. Maybe I'm just more aware of my surroundings and what's going on than the average person, or maybe I'm totally normal and my friends just don't pay attention. Whatever it is, sometimes I get this feeling. Oliver calls it my spidey sense. It's like a little buzzing voice somewhere in the back of my brain that makes me want to look around and make sure nothing is going on. And there that feeling was, creeping up my spine, making it feel like someone's breath was hot on the back of my neck. A familiar, buzzing alertness settling in the back of my head. Something's moving, paying attention. Tearing my attention away from Oliver, who was deep in the middle of a story about some crazy nightmare he had a few nights previously, I turned my head to survey the dark, endless wheat fields on both sides of the parked truck. Most of the time, it alerts me to nothing more than an animal quietly wandering around, but I usually figure it never hurts to check. The truck's engine was off, but the keys were in the ignition and turned so that the lights in the truck were on, illuminating a neat little circle around us and shining dimly a couple feet into the fields on each side of the truck. With a gentle wind, it all looked like a vast, waving ocean, separated in the centre by a pale dirt road that disappeared into the inky blackness outside of our little haven of light. I used to love the way tall grass and wheat fields looked when they were blowing in the breeze, uniform waves flowing back and forth. I couldn't see anything of interest on the left side of the road, closest to where Oliver was sitting, so I turned my head to look over my shoulder at the field on the right side of the road instead. Oliver kept talking, knowing me well enough by now to let me do my thing. It seemed to be the same thing on that side too. Nothing of interest. Until something, nearly at the bottom of my field of vision, caught my attention. It was a subtle movement, nothing crazy, but it was a big enough break in the smooth waving pattern of the field that it caught my eye. It wouldn't exactly be uncommon for an animal to have wandered in the middle of a field though, especially not this far away from town, where animals had a bit more free rein. If an animal, like a deer or a cow, had somehow gotten past this fence and wandered out this far, we would have seen it clearly above the growing wheat. The wheat hadn't grown tall enough yet to obscure anything that big. Anything smaller, like a rabbit or fox, would be able to slip around without us seeing it though. That's probably why, at first, I wasn't too concerned. Oliver had finally paused his story, leaning a bit closer to me and my side of the truck to try and figure out what I was looking at. I apologized and explained that I was still listening. I just thought I saw something. It's probably a fox or a raccoon out in the field, I said, even though I couldn't quite find it in me to tear my eyes away from the field. By this point, the waves of movement in the field were uniform again, giving the impression that whatever had been moving had stopped. I don't see anything, Oliver said, staring off into the distance and squinting his eyes like it might help him see better. I don't either. I just thought I saw something moving around in the field. I shook my head and leaned back, settling down on the blankets again. Probably a raccoon or something. With a sigh and quick shake of my head, I turned back around and faced Oliver. He eyed me for a second, but didn't say anything and launched right back into his story. Honestly, if we got freaked out every time a rabbit or a deer interrupted us by wandering around in the dark, we would never finish anything. Even though I had turned my attention back to Oliver, it was half-hearted at best. I couldn't shake the buzzing feeling in the back of my head, and even though I hadn't seen anything or been given an actual reason to be scared, it was starting to make me anxious. I had no reason to believe it was anything but an animal, but the fact that I hadn't seen the animal was bugging me. I was so caught up in my own head that I almost missed the subtle noises in the field behind me. My eyes shot back to the field, abruptly interrupting Oliver's story. I tried to listen closer, but the music from the stereo was too loud. I waved my hand at Oliver a few times, hoping he might read my mind and get the hint, before I leaned closer to him and was able to grab his arm. Wait. I patted my hand on his arm once or twice, furrowing my brow as I looked from him to the field and back to him again. Turn your music down, pause it or something. Oliver reached for his phone, which was lying face down in the blanket in front of him, and pressed pause. I almost immediately wished that I hadn't asked him to do so. The noise we heard once the music was off was loud, much louder than I thought, and sent a slow shiver up my spine once I could hear it clearly. I couldn't pinpoint from where in the field it was coming from. It sounded like it was in front of us and behind us all at once. It was a low, pitiful groaning sound, coupled with a sharp chittering noise, like someone was moaning through chattering teeth. If it was an animal, it sounded in pain, but something told me it wasn't an animal. Above all, there was silence. We could hear no bugs, no other animals, nothing else. Oliver, I whispered, swallowing dryly, my hand still on his arm. Please tell me you can hear that. With my sights trained on the field again, I strained my eyes, looking in the same spot I'd seen the movement last time, only to have a sharp movement in the ditch at the edge of the road catch my eye. I nearly jumped out of my skin, turning my head to get a look. The tall grass in the ditch right by the side of the road was swaying, maybe a foot away from where the lights from the truck ended, and then it was on the road. It was too dark that far down the road behind us to truly see what was crawling through the dirt, but if the clumsy, skittering movements of its limbs flashing just out of reach of the circle of light were anything to go by, it wasn't a kind of animal I had ever seen. We realized, too late, as it was pulling itself into the left field and rustling through the wheat, that whatever that thing was, it was circling us, stalking, hunting. For a moment after it disappeared, the wheat stood still and everything was silent. Oliver and I were frozen. My ears were straining to hear anything aside from my own terrified breathing, dreading the sound of low, dry moaning or teeth chattering together. What followed the stillness were a series of dry, clumsy vocalizations, garbled and uncomfortable to hear. I twisted my finger in the fabric of Oliver's jacket, scared halfway out of my mind. It sounded hollow, like something was trying to wrap its mouth around words that didn't quite fit. We listened for a second in horror as the noises grew louder, and then we realized it was trying to speak. Oliver. A drawn-out, twisted version of what sounded like Oliver's name called to us from the ditch, coupled with a hollow sound of slowly gnashing teeth. It tried again, voice scratchy and pained. Oliver. Pass. It. Pass. Pause. A deep, gravelly groan punctuated the deeply wrung attempt at the sentence, and I came to a cold realization. It was listening to us. Not only that, it was mimicking us. Mimicking me. Next to me, Oliver whispered a sharp expletive under a shaky exhale. Climb through the window, I whispered through clenched teeth, my breath catching in my throat as I tried not to panic. Start the truck. I released his arm, my fingers burning from how hard I had been gripping the fabric of his jacket. Oliver said nothing, but I was answered with the same sharp, shockingly loud, chittering noise from earlier. Oliver leaned forward onto his knees, reaching out with shaky fingers to grab the open window at the back of his truck. I thanked whatever God might be listening that Oliver had always been a skinny kid, so he could at least fit through the window. Oliver. Stringing the syllables together, sounding more like a person with every passing second, the thing in the field groaned and chattered away as Oliver slowly pulled his upper body through the window. Oliver. I was too scared to move. I didn't want to try climbing in through the window for fear of taking my eyes off the section of grass where I had last seen movement, and I was absolutely not about to get out of the bed and try to go around to get in the passenger seat. I wasn't moving or taking my eyes off the field until we were off this godforsaken road. Oliver, please tell me you can hear that. I stared into the dark as a pitchy, dry version of my own voice bounced back at me. It had practiced my words until it could string them all together. The sentence was choppy, stilted, and the emphasis was off, but it sounded like me. Whatever it was started to slowly creep through the wheat that was hiding it so well. I could make out the path it took, following the sideways parting of the wheat, standing out from the rest, which was barely moving now that the breeze had died down. It moved slowly. After the way it skittered across the road, I knew it was intentional. The movement was nearly lined up with the side of the truck now. As Oliver pulled his legs through and finally flipped around, getting situated in the front seat as quickly as he could, I watched the subtle movement grow closer to the fence. If it passed the fence, all that would be in the way of it getting to us was a shallow ditch, and I had a feeling that wouldn't do much to stop it. The sound of the engine starting up nearly made me cry. Oliver wasted no time in stomping on the gas as soon as the engine started up and he could throw it in drive. Over the sound of the engine and the tires throwing gravel, I could distinctly hear the sound of quickly gnashing teeth, and as we peeled out and quickly picked up pace, the thing shot forward through the ditch. As it did, I saw distinct flashes of dirty, peeling, rotting skin, like it was bubbling up and flaking right off its bones. As it reached the ditch and scrambled for the road, I saw its hand, and that was enough for me. Without thinking, I reached through the window and into the cab and slammed my hand up into the lights, switching them off. I didn't want to see whatever was going to come crawling out of that field. It only half worked. As we sped away, I could see the vague shape of it behind us on the road, racing to catch us. It seemed much bigger than I thought, and if we hadn't been in a truck, we never would have been able to outrun it. Its movement seemed clumsy almost, but it didn't seem to have any trouble running around after us. Eventually, we lost it. Our speed outmatched it, and it fell behind with a series of growling moans. As soon as I couldn't see it anymore, I felt safe enough to climb back into the cab of the truck through the window. I wasn't going to ask Oliver to stop or pull over so I could climb into the seat regularly. Neither of us said anything as we turned the corner and took the fastest way back to town that we could. I stared at the dashboard. The image of the mangled, rotting hand with cut-up, bleeding fingers reaching through the grass burned into my mind. There were a few stories floating around town for the next week. Apparently, along the road where we had been parked, something had ripped the entire section of fence out of the ground, snapping the wires and breaking the wood posts. The whole area of wheat and grass was destroyed, trampled into the earth. I don't like thinking about what could have happened if we hadn't been in a truck, or what could have happened to Oliver or anyone else if they had been alone when that thing started mimicking voices. And I prefer not to think about the fact that it had been hunting us, probably the whole time we had been parked on that road. We avoid that area now. I wonder sometimes if that thing is still mad that its prey got away.